In this world, ultimate power doesn't reside in the White House, and it certainly doesn't belong to those guys in suits trading stocks on Wall Street. It belongs to the ancient financial oligarchs, the old money, who wait for a nation's credit to collapse so they can sweep in like the Grim Reaper and harvest distressed assets for pennies on the dollar. Today, we are tearing open the darkest page in American financial history. We're going to break down exactly how J.P. Morgan engineered a liquidity crisis to execute an epic, hostile takeover of the United States of America. Once you understand this 100-year-old power play, you'll finally see who actually controls your wealth today. Our story begins in 1895 with a humiliating struggle on the brink of a sovereign debt default. America was bleeding. The country was in the grips of a terrifying economic depression. Railroad bubbles had burst, thousands of businesses were bankrupt, and unemployed workers roamed the streets. But the most fatal risk was happening at the very core of national power. The U.S. Treasury was running completely dry. Foreign investors were dumping American assets and demanding gold in return. The Treasury faced a massive bank run on its gold reserves, plummeting below the $100 million red line needed to keep the country afloat. In less than 3 weeks, without a massive injection of liquidity, the United States of America was going to default on its debt. President Grover Cleveland was desperate, but normal banks didn't have the kind of cash to save a nation. Just as the country was staring down the barrel of total systemic collapse, a man with a distinctive red nose, puffing on a cigar, rolled into Washington on his private train. He was John Pierpont Morgan, the true, behind-the-scenes dictator of Wall Street. Morgan wasn't there for charity. He was there for the most unbelievable distressed asset buyout in human history. Coldly, he told the president that he and his syndicate of European old money could provide 3.5 million ounces of gold to keep the government's lights on. But the price? The U.S. government had to issue a $30 million bond directly to Morgan's syndicate at a massive discount. The president had no choice. He signed the humiliating bailout deal. The moment the news broke, market sentiment flipped. International capital stopped the bank run simply because Morgan's name was on the deal. The government was saved, but the American public was furious. They woke up to a terrifying reality. The economic lifeblood of the nation wasn't controlled by their elected government anymore. It was held hostage by a single, unregulated private banker. But this was just a warm-up for Morgan's empire. Over the next decade, he demonstrated textbook capital devouring. Using his bottomless liquidity pool, he waited for the bottom of the economic cycle to ruthlessly hunt down premium companies struggling with cash flow. He forced competing railroads to merge, creating a super conglomerate that monopolized American transit. He bought out steel magnate Andrew Carnegie to create the first billion-dollar behemoth in human history, U.S. Steel. In J.P. Morgan's dictionary, free market competition didn't exist. There was only absolute order and monopoly. He used ruthless risk management to crush any rival who threatened his pricing power. Back then, from the train you rode to the steel in your buildings to the electricity lighting your home at night, the underlying profits all flowed straight into the balance sheets of the House of Morgan. However, what truly cemented Morgan's absolute supremacy was the historical chain reaction crash 12 years later. In that catastrophe, Morgan showed the world exactly how much wealth you can harvest when you play both the arsonist and the firefighter. Enter October 1907. A sudden credit crisis swept through New York's financial district like the Black Plague. The trigger? A foolishly failed short squeeze by retail speculators that caused several over-leveraged trust companies to face margin calls. Panic spread instantly. Terrified citizens rushed to the banks to withdraw their deposits. A classic bank run was underway. Keep in mind, America had no central bank back then. There was no lender of last resort to inject emergency liquidity. As trust companies fell one by one, Wall Street plunged into a deathly despair. The stock market faced a stampede-style crash. Millionaires were wiped out in hours, and the New York Stock Exchange was moments away from shutting its doors completely. At the very moment financial doomsday arrived, every bank president, trust company boss, and even the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury flocked to 36 Madison Avenue, J.P. Morgan's private library. For the next 2 weeks, this room, filled with Renaissance antiques, became the shadow cabinet of the American economy. The 70-year-old Morgan sat by the fireplace, coldly assessing these near-bankrupt bankers like a grim reaper picking his spoils. He demanded they hand over their underlying asset ledgers for his team to conduct brutal due diligence. He wasn't saving everybody. He was using this liquidity drought to execute a ruthless financial purge. For the institutions that competed with him or held garbage assets, he let them die, leaving their retail depositors as the ultimate bag holders. But for the banks holding premium core assets that were just suffering a temporary cash crunch, Morgan forced them to sell their equity at rock-bottom prices before he mercifully injected a lifeline of cash. Right inside this suffocating library, the most famous financial shakedown in history took place. Late into the night of November 2, 1907, Morgan gathered over 50 of New York's top banking executives. Then, he did something that chilled everyone to the bone. He walked to the heavy brass doors, locked them from the inside, and slipped the key into his pocket. He coldly informed these masters of the universe that no one was leaving the room until they pooled together a $25 million bailout fund and signed a joint guarantee. This wasn't a negotiation. It was absolute power suppression. After hours of suffocating silence, where grown men broke down and yielded in despair, the last banker signed the agreement at 4:45 a.m. Only then did Morgan take out the key and unlock the doors. The NYSE was saved at the opening bell, and the entire U.S. financial system avoided a total meltdown. The next day, newspapers nationwide hailed Morgan as the superhero who saved the republic. But when the dust settled, politicians and the public woke up to see who the real winner was. Through this liquidity crisis, the House of Morgan had surgically cleansed its competitors. He swallowed the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company for pennies, completing his steel monopoly in the South. Ordinary people saw their wealth vaporize in the crash, while Morgan's balance sheet experienced unprecedented, manic expansion. But the most chilling part wasn't the money he made. It was the systemic threat he demonstrated to Washington. A private banker holding zero public office possessed more credit backing and capital mobilizing power than the entire state apparatus. If he could save the country, he could just as easily destroy it. Morgan himself knew that playing the lender of last resort with his own cash flow was a high-risk game. To permanently institutionalize this monopoly and transfer the risk entirely to the public, Morgan and his syndicate allies began plotting the most secretive and massive foundational rewrite in financial history. In November 1910, on a highly secluded estate off the coast of Georgia called Jekyll Island, a secret meeting took place that changed the course of world history. 7 ultra-elite financial oligarchs, representing the Morgans, the Rockefellers, and European old money, snuck onto the island under assumed names. They controlled a quarter of the world's wealth and held the ultimate codes to monetary mechanics. In complete isolation, they spent 9 days drafting a top-secret document. That document was the original blueprint for the Federal Reserve Act. Under the careful design of these apex predators, a super beast called the Federal Reserve System was born. On the surface, It looked like a government central bank designed to stabilize the market. But in reality, it was the ultimate financial moat built by Wall Street titans to permanently control the issuance and pricing of money. They successfully stripped the supreme power of creating liquidity and setting interest rates away from elected officials, and handed it over to a shadow alliance of elite bankers. From that moment on, ancient capital oligarchs never had to use their own gold to plug market holes like Morgan did. When a crisis hits, they simply sit at the top of the system, use the government's backing to legally print money, dilute the purchasing power of the working class, and elegantly execute risk hedging and cross-cycle wealth transfers. In 1913, J.P. Morgan closed his eyes for the final time in a luxury hotel in Rome. He didn't leave behind as much surface cash as people thought, but he left behind an invisible web of power more massive and unshakable than any empire. Today, when you look at complex macroeconomic data, watch the Fed's rate hike cycles, or see inflation slowly devouring the down payment you worked so hard to save, you need to understand something. This was never a natural economic cycle. This is a harvesting system, and its source code was written over a century ago by financial oligarchs. In this system, ordinary people spend their lives fighting inflation, while the true old money families stay at the very top of the wealth pyramid simply by controlling the liquidity valves. If you want to survive in this brutal financial jungle, you have to learn to think like them. Subscribe to the channel, and in the next video, we'll continue to tear down the wealth illusions hidden by history.